Based on the criticism that this bill has received from all sides, I would say that the government has actually destroyed a balance that previously existed. The bill is opposed by most provinces. It is opposed by hunters and sport shooters. It has been opposed by police witnesses who have appeared on this bill and have said it will do nothing to stop the illegal guns on the streets. Criminal Justice section of the Canadian Bar Association said that the red flag provisions in the bill simply duplicate powers that already exist. What do you or what does the government actually believe it has accomplished?
Target acquired.
Bill, second reading, projet de loi deuxième lecture, number 2, C-21.
Senator Yussuff.
Thank you, Speaker. I woke up this morning and I couldn't remember where I left off yesterday. Then on my way over here, I did remember.
Start at the beginning.
And I'm sure my friend Don Plett can't wait for me to finish my speech. So let me, of course, be clear. There is no obligation for victims to use this law. And this was in the section, the red and yellow flag provisions in the legislation. There will be other offer additional, there will be there to offer additional protection. I'd like to share a few more important statistics today. We know that more available guns are, the higher the risk in homicide and suicide. Handguns are the most commonly used firearm in homicide. Suicide by firearm account for 73% of all firearms deaths in Canada between 2000 and 2020. During this period, some 11,000 individuals took their lives. Since 2010, we've seen close to 16,000 incidents of violent crime involving firearms in Canada. Reducing the number of handguns and assault-style firearms in our community will result in reducing the number of victims of gun violence. I hope we can get an agreement on one other important measures that this bill I would like to talk about now, and that is what it will do to curb firearms smuggling and trafficking. The smuggling of firearms into Canada remains an important threat towards the safety of Canadians and directly impact firearms and firearm-related violence that has been felt in communities across the country. In 2021, the CBSA seized more than 1,100 firearms, more than double the number from 2020, including the seizure of 56 prohibited firearms at the Blue Water Bridge port of entry in Sarnia, Ontario, one of the largest single firearm seizures in southern Ontario region in recent history. More recently, the CBSA worked with partners to seize some 46 prohibited or restricted firearms at a highway stop in Cornwall, Ontario. Bill C-21 will address, of course, illegal smuggling and trafficking at the border by increasing the maximum criminal penalties for firearm smuggling and trafficking from 10 years to 14 years, as well as providing more tools to law enforcement to investigate firearms crimes and strengthening the border security measures. Increasing the maximum penalty for smuggling and trafficking offences will be a message to criminals, and just as important to the courts, that Parliament unequivocally denounce these crimes. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police support these measures when they appeared during the study of the bill at committee in the other place. Quote, they said, with regard to firearms smuggling and trafficking, we support the implementation of new firearms-related offences, intensify border controls and strengthening penalties to help deter criminal activities and to combat firearms smuggling and trafficking. thereby reducing the risk that illegal firearms find their way into Canadian communities and are used to commit criminal offences. The CACP welcomed the changes that provide new police authorization and tools to access information about license holders in their investigation of individuals who are suspected of conducting criminal activities such as straw purchases of weapons and trafficking. And that brings me, of course, back to the recently introduced amendments to Bill C-21s. They were adopted at committee stage in the other place, including new prospective definition for characteristics of assault-type firearm and recognize and respecting Aboriginal treaty rights of Indigenous people. These have been informed by discussion with stakeholders across the country. They include hunters and trappers, First Nation, Inuits, and Métis, and rural northern residents, targeted shooters, and others. Honourable colleagues, it doesn't matter where you go in this country, in every corner, from coast to coast, you will find skilled, experienced hunters who are more than happy to chat with you for hours, but how it is more than just a hobby for them, how it has been passed down through generation, and how it forms a key part of their culture and way of life. And that's why these latest amendments, I think, provide clarity and protections around reasonable gun ownership, responsible gun ownership. Furthermore, they reflect the important cultural perspective of Indigenous people across the country. The bill respects and recognizes traditional cultural importance for hunting of Indigenous communities. The government also recognized the importance of consultation and cooperation with Indigenous people to ensure consistency of federal laws with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. While the government has acted through a prospective technical definition to prevent assault-style firearms from getting into our communities, this bill also includes a specific clause that clearly states that nothing in this definition is intended to derogate from the rights of Indigenous people under Section 35 of the Constitution. The government also continues to signal its commitment to continue working with Indigenous communities and engaging in an open dialogue regarding any unintended impact the bill may have on Indigenous people. There will be further opportunity for engagement in the Indigenous community across Canada, and if and when the bill passes in the Senate and the House. The government has pledged it will continue to seek out the views and perspective of various Indigenous groups and will, of course, consult during the regulatory process, as well as during the implementation phase of specific measures in the bill. In conclusion, colleagues, the goal of this bill is to keep communities safe. I think none of us will disagree with that. As we know, no single program or initiative can end gun violence alone. I know gun control by itself will not solve all the problems associated with gun violence. But it is an important piece of the puzzle and will make a significant difference. This is why I think C-21 is just one of the many government initiatives aimed at keeping our communities safe across this country. It seeks to cap the number of handguns in circulation by creating a freeze on the sale, purchases, and transfers of handguns. It creates a new definition for assault-style firearms that only applies to newly designed and manufactured weapons after the bill will become law. It creates yellow and red flag laws to reduce firearms-related family violence and self-harm. It raises the maximum sentence for illegal gun smugglers and traffickers at the border from 10 years to 14 years. And it takes action against ghost guns that are becoming a serious problem in our country. What the bill doesn't do, colleagues, it doesn't take one gun away from any legal gun owner in this country, whether they're a handgun owner, a hunter, or a sports shooter. I want to be perfectly clear. That is, if you own a legal handgun, you can still keep it after this bill becomes law. If you own a legal long gun, this bill does not impact your firearm. Colleague, as I asked when I start my speech, I view this bill in terms of weighing the privileges with rights to try and find a fair balance. So then I weigh the restrictions to privilege to own a certain type of firearm with the rights of Canadians to a safe country free of gun violence. I feel confident the bill gets the balance right. Colleagues, I hope that after you give careful consideration to this bill, you will agree it is both fair and balanced and support this bill going to committee. Thank you so much.
Senator Plett.
Yes, I'm wondering if the senator would take a couple of questions.
With pleasure, my friend.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure tomorrow Mr. Garriston will again tweet that I am stalling this bill because I had the audacity to ask questions on this. Since he already did that before you even introduced the bill, I was already stalling it. So I'm not sure what he's going to say now. Senator Yussuff, you cited about how many deaths there were from firearms and so on and so forth, number of times. You never used, at any point did you tell us how many of these deaths were with legal firearms, just with firearms. I don't think there's a person in this chamber that disagrees on us clamping down with illegal firearms. I certainly do. It's not the legal firearms that are the problem, it's the illegal firearms. You talk about increasing the sentences from 10 to 14 years for smuggling. I want you to square this box for me, Senator Yussuff. You're talking about that the Liberal government wants to increase penalties. And yet, the Liberal government repealed, with Bill C-5, they repealed minimum firearm sentences for the robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, discharging a firearm with intent, using firearm in the commission of offenses, possession of firearm knowing its possession is unauthorized, possession of prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, possession of weapon obtained by the commission of an offense, discharging a firearm recklessly. So if this is a government that is bent on stopping crime with firearms, why would they repeal all of these minimum sentences? Why wouldn't they rather try to even increase those as opposed to repealing them? And stop going after the legal firearms owners and start going after the illegal ones.
Senator Yussuff.
Well, first, let me thank you for your question. Senator Plett, as you know, the courts have ruled in regard to minimum sentence, and the government reflected on that in regard to its action. But in regard to the average sentence for smuggling and convictions currently, on average, those who are convicted serve 8 years of their sentence, what's basically in the law. And as you know, as I said in my speech, the government has signaled again they will increase, of course, the sentencing for those who are smuggling guns in our country. There are many different things that the government is doing, of course, to deal with firearms, of course, infractions at a community level, how we can get young people not to get in, of course, to habits where they associate with individuals who might get them into gun crime, and they've dedicated a lot of resources to ensure we can achieve that. They're working in many borders community to ensure the smuggling, of course, raising the awareness and support for police officers in the front line to ensure we don't have illegal guns in our country. And I think those efforts need to continue as long as necessary, because criminals who want to smuggle illegal firearms in our country will continue to do so. We have to find ways to combat that and, of course, work to strengthen the legislation. I think this bill offers us some direction to ensure those things can happen, but at the same time supporting our frontline officers who are doing their best at the border and other areas to ensure they can interdict, catch those people, and ultimately, of course, get them in the legal system so we can try them and ensure they serve sentence for the behavior that they're involved in.
Senator Plett.
Well, if I could ask a couple of more questions, and unless somebody else wants to speak, or I have a few questions, but I will yield to others if they also do. Senator Yussuff, in your remarks you said, and I quote, "There has been a growing increase in the prevalence of handguns in Canada. Between 2010 and 2020, the number of handguns increased by 74% to 1 million handguns, owned by approximately 275,000 individuals in our country. Research shows that the availability of firearms in developed countries and the incidence of firearm crimes, violence, and misuse are correlated. But Senator Yussuff, there is in fact no such correlation between legal handgun purchases in Canada and crime on Canadian streets. When it comes to handguns, the Toronto Deputy Police Chief, and I certainly support us giving our law enforcement all the tools. You and I absolutely agree on that issue. But the Toronto Deputy Police Chief, Myron Demke, has said, and I quote, "They're not domestically sourced. They are internationally sourced. Our problem in Toronto is handguns from the United States." So how is going after our legal sport shooters supposed to reduce the crime on the Toronto streets?
Senator Yussuff.
Well, I don't want to comment on what a frontline officer is saying in regard to his perspective. I don't know the context in which, of course, he's reflecting on what he said, and I respect, obviously, his opinion in that regard. I think you and I would agree there's a lot of illegal handguns coming into our country at many of our borders across the country. It's been identified, and the government has allocated a significant amount of resources to help our frontline officers deal with that. Of course, handguns in general, of course, what the government wants to do, and our municipalities in general, urban areas have been calling for the government to take action on reducing the number of guns in their community, and I think this bill reflects that consensus to a large extent in large urban areas across the country. They want to see a reduction of guns in their community, and they recognize, of course, yes, there's illegal guns, but also legal guns sometimes end up causing harm, of course, in domestic violence, and it causes harm to individuals in the context what we're seeing where those individuals are struggling with mental health issue, use their own handguns or other guns to, of course, inflict harm on themselves. So there are some challenges that we have to recognize, we have to deal with in the broader context of guns. And in no way, of course, sports shooters are going to be impacted by this bill. This bill lays out provision how sports shooters can continue to do their craft. There's recognition how they will continue to access their gun and use it to pursue their sports, as is recognized in the bill, and which was enhanced, of course, in the other place before the bill got over here.
Senator Plett, I have Senator Dean. Maybe I will come back to you. Senator Dean.
Thank you, Speaker. Senator Yussuff, I too would be concerned if sports shooters were impacted negatively by legislation of this sort. But if I have an initial reading of the legislation correct, sports shooters who are part of sporting federations would be unaffected in the sense that they would be exempted from the requirements in this legislation with respect to handguns and other guns if they were in a program of training and exercises that led towards regional or national or international competitions. So I'm just checking on that. The second question that I have is that a number of us I know were alarmed last weekend to learn of a tragic shooting in Ontario, I believe it was Hamilton, in which a Canadian landlord gunned down two of his tenants as they fled from the rental home after a dispute over property. Police said that witnesses saw a young couple, both in their mid-20s, fleeing from their Hamilton, Ontario home. Following the killings, the gunman barricaded himself in the apartment, and there was more tragedy involved because the gunman himself ended up dying in an altercation with police. The point here is that we learned from reading about this that the killer was a gun owner and several handguns and rifles were found in the home, and furthermore they were registered to that user. In addition to the first question, would you have any comment on the second one?
Senator Yussuff.
Again, thank you for the question, Senator Dean. It's hard to reflect on what happened in Hamilton, Ontario. I think as parents, as family, I think we all are shocked. These were two young people who seems in their prime, trying to build their lives, and for whatever happened, we'll find out later in the courts. But it is true that what has been reported so far, this was the person who committed this terrible act, had guns that he legally acquired and was licensed to carry. And again, you know, in the context of gun violence, even good people do bad things. I think the red flag and the yellow flag provision of this bill will hopefully aid in the future in preventing some of those situations. Should somebody suspect something of happening, they could bring it to the authorities and they could intervene, either to confiscate the gun or to take away the license and to put some restrictions on that individual. Of course, that did not happen here, so we don't have to foresight into the future. But we know in other places, like the United States, where there are red and yellow flag laws, it have made a significant difference in a lot of ways in preventing these kinds of situations from repeating themselves. And I'm hoping if the bill does pass, this will aid in the future. Had people known there were some issues in that home and in that landlord, that they could have brought it to the authorities to ensure that could happen. Now, nobody did that, but I think the government is committed that if the bill does pass, those provisions will get some education and pronouncement so the public will know better how to use them in an effective way. In regard to sports shooters, I think it's critical for us to recognize the important role they play in the Olympics and Paralympics family in our country. And for those who desire to continue to be in that sports, I don't think this bill should impact them in any form, shape, or way. There are some requirements how they can access if they're legitimately involved in the sports and continue to practice their sports and train for their sports going forward. So the bill clearly recognizes that. I think it was aided and improved in the other place as a result of the debate that took place, and of course those who went before the committee.
Senator Plett, I have Senator Cardozo, and then I'll give you the floor. Senator Cardozo.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Senator Yussuff, for être parrain de cet projet de loi.
Thank you for the.
I want to ask you about the last round of amendments that the government brought in. There were certainly some of the advocates for gun laws and stronger gun laws who felt that the government had watered down the legislation more than they expected and more than they were pleased to. What is your response to those who feel the law, that the bill as it stands, is not strong enough?
Senator Yussuff.
Thank you, Senator Cardozo, for your question. In hindsight, in 2020, I think, again, in the context of the government initiating this bill and trying to get support in the other place with the opposition, they end up achieving three parties supporting the bill. And some of the amendments in the bill had the support of all the parties in the other place. Recognizing in order to get a piece of legislation over here, there were compromises made in regard to what the legislation currently reflects. On a personal view, reading the bill and watching the issue being debated, I think they reached a balance in trying to bring forth a piece of legislation that Canadians have been demanding for the government to act on for quite some time. And I think they reflect that. I'm sure when the committee hearing starts, we will hear from those who think the bill has gone too far and for those who think it hasn't gone far enough. I think we'll get to evaluate that for ourselves as senators and make a judgment. From my perspective as a sponsor of the bill, I believe that the bill has struck a balance. And I'm hoping that colleagues will see that, not only in the context of the debate here, but also what the witnesses will say when they come before the committee. Thank you so much.
Senator Plett.
Well, thank you. I want to make one comment about the sport shooters. And of course, I will be making my own speech on this in the next little while if the government leader doesn't decide to put closure on it before we get to it next week. But I do want to make a comment about the sport shooters because, in fact, allowing sport shooters to continue, as this bill, you're right, it does, is a little bit like saying you can play hockey, but we will start hockey at the NHL. Nobody below NHL level can play hockey because that's what this does. We can still have the Olympic shooters, but we can't have the amateurs training to come up. Now, you're right, the bill speaks about we want to deal with this, but it's not dealing with it. So this is, again, the government saying, trust us. Trust us. We will deal with this. But it's not in the bill, Senator Yussuff. Right now, the way the bill reads, you can go to the Olympics and be a sport shooter, but you can't practice going up to the Olympics. So how many people will we have in the Olympics if we can't train them? Just one final question, and I thank you for your indulgence, Senator Yussuff, but you do state, and I'll quote, fundamentally for me, and you said it again, this bill is about striking a fair balance between the right of Canadians to safe communities and the privilege of Canadians to own certain types or models of guns for hunting and sport shooting, and finding that balance is no easy task. And I do agree with you, finding that balance is no easy task. But based on the criticism that this bill has received from all sides, I would say that the government has actually destroyed a balance that previously existed, Senator Yussuff. The bill is opposed by most provinces. It is opposed by hunters and sport shooters, even though you say sport shooters will be able to continue. It has been opposed by police witnesses who have appeared on this bill and have said it will do nothing to stop the illegal guns on the streets. The Criminal Justice section of the Canadian Bar Association has said that the red flag provisions in the bill simply duplicate powers that already exist to seize firearms from persons who may be a danger to themselves or others. So, Senator Yussuff, what do you or what does the government actually believe it has accomplished in the face of all this opposition?
Senator Yussuff.
Well, again, thank you for your question and, of course, your comments. The reality, of course, I think we probably won't agree that this bill has achieved balance because you have a perspective, and I respect that. And equally, I hope you will respect mine. That there were many witnesses who went before the committee, including the chiefs of police, who spoke to provisions in the bill that will interdict guns at the border. They support those measures. They're not against them. I understand some of the witnesses, yes, don't like certain provisions in the bill and have spoken out against that. But I think it would be wrong to suggest there's not support for this bill. For many aspects of the witnesses that come before the committee in the other place to talk about the provisions in the bill. I do believe in the context of debate around guns in our country, as it is in other places that we have witnessed, there's always going to be some polarization. But I think as honourable senators in this place, we recognize the importance to try to find a balance and to do the right thing. And I think this bill achieves that. It may not be perfect from a certain perspective, but I believe if it's passed and it should become law, will make a significant difference to make our countries and our communities a safer place for all of us. I think there will always be those who disagree there should be no restriction on them owning guns in this country. But the reality is, I do believe there has to be some restrictions. I was fortunate to go to the RCMP gun vault at the beginning of my tenure to understand some of the complexity in the work that they're doing. I came away from there frightened, not because of what they were doing, but when they showed me the guns that they had interdicted across the country that I was privy to look at, I was literally scared out of my pants because I couldn't understand why anybody would want to have any one of those weapons. These were not even toys. These were like machines that was created to kill human beings in a massive way. They brought them into our country and they were interdicted. And I know there are many in our country today. My point, Senator, is that we will get this bill to committee. I am sure there are things you and I will disagree on, and there are things we will agree on. We recognize we have to do something to improve the safety of Canadians in this country in a variety of ways. Interdicting guns that's coming in across our borders is one of those, but also trying to deal with gun violence that is happening in our country is another. Trying to ensure that young people don't get into the gun culture in our country is something we could also work at. And I think, as you know, the government has invested a significant amount of resources right across this country working on the front line. I think it's wrong for you to say the majority of provinces against the bill. I know some provinces against the bill. I live here in Ontario, and I certainly know my province haven't spoken out against this bill, because there's a recognition in Ontario we have to do something about gun violence in this country. So thank you so much for your question. I look forward, of course, to this bill going to committee, and I look forward to you speaking on the bill next week at second reading.
Senator Kutcher.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I rise today to speak to Bill C-21, specifically on an important topic that this bill may impact on, but has not been really addressed to date. That is, what will be the impact of this bill on suicide rates in Canada? My hope is that by raising this issue, that when the bill is referred to committee, the committee will seek input from expert witnesses on suicide prevention and gun control legislation. Colleagues, before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge that the material and the subject of my intervention can be very difficult for some people. It deals with life and death issues. It will touch on mental illness and self-harm. I would encourage any of our colleagues and anyone who is listening or watching this debate to know that if you are having difficulties or thoughts of self-harm, please seek help. Asking for help is a sign of strength, and there are many avenues for help and support. The importance of suicide prevention is well known in this chamber. The Standing Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology will soon be tabling its report on the study of the effectiveness of the National Suicide Prevention Framework on decreasing rates of suicide in Canada. Numerous senators have spoken to the importance of suicide prevention during our debate on the motion for said study, as well as debates on recent legislation in which the topic of suicide prevention was raised. I think we can safely say that our debates were very much in support of effective measures to reduce suicide rates in Canada. The most effective public health measure for suicide prevention is means restriction, such as better controls around gun availability. Suicide disproportionately impacts men. About 75% of suicides in Canada are men. And suicide, 3 times as common in men compared to women. The statistics related to suicide and guns are disheartening. Many studies have noted that firearms play a significant role in completed suicides, especially in men. The accessibility of lethal means, such as guns, during times of despair, can swiftly transform impulsive thoughts into irreversible action. In Canada, in the 5 years between 2016 and 2020, 2,777 men died from firearm suicide. Over that same period, 82 women died by similar means. That is a ratio of about 33 to 1, 10 times greater than the overall male to female suicide ratio. For additional context, when all fatal firearms injuries for that period are considered, about 70% were suicides, not homicides, colleagues, not homicides, suicides. 70% of gun-related deaths in Canada are suicide. A recent study in Ontario found that over 2/3 of firearm-related deaths were suicide, mostly men and mostly in rural areas. On average, during that period in Canada, about 550 men died by gun-related suicide per year. Compare that to a rate of less than 50 deaths per year from testicular cancer. And merely owning a handgun, just owning a handgun, is associated with much higher rates of suicide. A recent study of about 26 million people followed for a period of 12 years noted, and I will quote, "Men who owned handguns were 8 times more likely than men who didn't to die of self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Women who owned handguns were more than 35 times more likely than women who didn't to kill themselves with a gun," end quote. As policymakers who are truly concerned about suicide prevention, we bear the responsibility of recognizing this relationship between firearm ownership and suicide, and the need to take decisive action to address it. By acknowledging the connection between firearms ownership and suicide risk, we have the power to save lives and create a safer environment for all. Today, I'd like to emphasize the need for your support of a bill that limits access to firearms. By so doing, we may be able to reduce impulsive acts of self-harm that have a high probability of resulting in death. Robust research consistently demonstrates that when individuals in crisis face restricted access to lethal means, the likelihood of suicide diminishes. One of the best public health strategies for suicide prevention in males is limiting access to guns. Now, it is important to acknowledge that many different concerns, rather than suicide prevention, regarding this bill have been raised, and we have seen some of the discussion between Senator Plett and Senator Yussuff addressing those really important issues. We must address those concerns and seek common ground. Balancing responsible firearm access and suicide prevention related to firearms can be an attainable goal, one that respects the rights of gun owners while prioritizing public safety and preservation of lives. Effective implementation requires collaboration, open dialogue, and a willingness to find innovative solutions. We must draw upon the expertise of various stakeholders, including gun owners, mental health professionals, law enforcement agencies, and advocacy organizations. Enacting well-informed firearms legislation that recognizes these complexities should be our goal. We have an opportunity through our study of Bill C-21 to better understand how legislative interventions can be implemented to achieve the goal of means-restricted suicide prevention as it applies to firearms in Canada. Some studies of the impact of Bill C-51, Canada's Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1977, suggested that that legislation may have had an impact in decreasing suicide-related gun suicide. Other studies of the impact of that legislation and other bills, C-17 in 1991 and C-68 in 1995, suggested more nuanced outcomes. Realizing that not all legislation related to firearms restrictions is the same, I hope that the committee studying C-21 considers how to encourage the government to conduct a detailed analysis on the impact of this bill on firearm suicide rates in males in Canada. We need to know that information. And the committee could make a point of calling witnesses that can help us understand that and how that works in Canada. Colleagues, as we critically study this legislation, we need to address the multitude of issues that it touches on. Like you, I've been made aware of numerous concerns, reasonable and good concerns, about C-21 raised by many Canadians. Although I have waded through countless emails and letters, I have not seen anyone raising this issue. That is the relationship between male suicide rates and gun ownership in the Canadian context. Thank you for allowing me to raise it here. I hope the committee will consider calling witnesses that can speak to this issue in more depth, and that we all keep this important association in mind as we ponder on how we move this legislation forward. Thank you, merci, and Walalia.
Senator Martin.
I move the adjournment to the debate.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Martin, seconded by the Honourable Senator Seidman, that further debate be adjourned until the next sitting of the Senate. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? Carried. Adopté.